The whole town of Harwick, Maine watched them and laughed. Walter and Evelyn Marsh, 69 and 67 years old, homeless, and down to their last $4, had just spent three of those dollars on a rotting heap of boards so completely swallowed by wild blackberry vines that you couldn't tell where the plan ended and the building began. People said it wasn't even worth the $3. People said the Marshes had finally lost their minds. What nobody said, what nobody in Harwick could have possibly imagined on that gray October morning, was that behind that warped, vine-strangled door was a secret the entire town had forgotten for 175 years. A secret worth more than every house on Main Street combined. And the two people standing in the weeds with a handwritten bill of sale and a bent brass key were exactly the right people to find it. Stay with this story, because what happens when the people everyone wrote off discover that they were sitting on the foundation of everything? It will change how you see value, how you see age, and how you see the quiet dignity of people the world has decided to stop noticing. Walter Marsh had been a carpenter for 41 years. Not a contractor with a business card and fleet of trucks, but a working carpenter. The kind who showed up at 6 in the morning and stayed until the job was right, who could read a warped floor the way other people read a newspaper, who had rebuilt half the porches in Harwick over 4 decades, and never once done work he was ashamed of. Evelyn had taught 4th grade at Harwick Elementary for 32 years. She had the particular quality of patience that comes from spending your professional life with 9-year-olds. A patience that was not passive but active, calibrated, capable of holding a room steady in its worst moment without appearing to do anything at all. They had been married for 43 years. They owned a small Cape-style house on Orchard Road that Walter had largely built himself, piece by piece, over the first decade of their marriage. They had 2 grown children, a daughter in Oregon and a son in North Carolina, both of whom called on Sundays and visited at Christmas and lived the kind of full, forward-facing lives that good parents raise their children to live. They had a savings account with $42,000 in it, accumulated over decades of careful, unglamorous thrift. They had a paid-off truck. They had the modest, solid security of people who had worked honestly their entire lives and asked nothing of anyone they hadn't earned. Then Walter's heart did what hearts sometimes do, without warning or apology. The attack came on a Thursday morning in February. Walter was in the driveway, scraping ice off the truck windshield. He made it back inside, which the doctors would later say was fortunate beyond ordinary probability. The surgery that followed, a triple bypass performed over 5 hours at the hospital in Portland, was described by his cardiologist as successful, which was accurate in the sense that Walter lived, and incomplete in the sense that what survival cost him would take 2 more years to fully understand. The insurance covered the hospital stay. It covered most of the surgery. It did not cover the cardiac rehabilitation program that his cardiologist said was not optional if Walter wanted his heart to hold for another decade. It did not cover the 3 medications he would take for the rest of his life, 2 of which were not on the plan's formulary. It did not cover the follow-up procedure 18 months later when a stent placed during the original surgery showed partial occlusion and needed to be addressed before it became another emergency. $42,000 in savings lasted 14 months. After the savings, they took a second mortgage on the house. After the second mortgage, Evelyn went back to tutoring, which brought in some money but not enough. Walter could not do physical work for 8 months after the surgery, and when he could return to carpentry, his stamina had changed in ways that made the long days harder. He took what jobs he could. It was not enough. By the following autumn, 2 years after the bypass, they were behind on both the mortgage and the second mortgage. The bank had begun the process that banks begin impersonally, systematically, because that is what banks do. Their financial advisor, a kind man who had helped them plan for retirement, told them with genuine sorrow that he did not see a path that preserved the house. The equity they had built over 40 years had been spent on Walter's life. That was the exact arithmetic of it, and there was no softening the arithmetic. They sold the house in April. After the mortgages and the remaining medical debt, They cleared $11,000. They moved into an apartment, thinking $11,000 was enough to rebuild. But Walter's carpentry income was inconsistent, and Evelyn's tutoring filled only some of the gap. An apartment rent in Harwick had climbed since the last time they had rented anything. And by September of that year, the $11,000 was gone, and the rent was 3 months behind. The eviction notice came on a Wednesday. They packed what would fit in the truck. Not everything fit. 43 years of a life together. And what remained after the hospital and the house and the apartment was 2 boxes of photographs, a toolbox, their clothes, Evelyn's collection of books she had used for 32 years of teaching, and Walter's woodworking tools, which he kept because they were both his livelihood and the one category of possession he could not bring himself to sell. They parked the truck behind a Methodist church on Elm Street, which had a back lot the pastor had quietly told them they could use for a few days in the way that good people offer small impossible kindnesses when they do not know what else to offer. On the 5th morning in the truck, Evelyn counted what was in her wallet. $3.42. Walter had $2 in his coat pocket. $5.42. That was what remained of 43 years. It was Evelyn who saw the sign. They had driven into town that morning because the truck cab was cold and the diner on Mill Street let you sit with a coffee for a long time without making you feel like you're being moved along. They were on their way back, driving slowly because driving slowly used less gas, when Evelyn said stop and Walter stopped. The sign was handwritten on a piece of cardboard, taped to a telephone pole in front of the old Pemberton property at the edge of town. Estate sale. Contents and structures. Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 4. Cash only. The Pemberton address. It's today, Evelyn said. Evelyn. Walter's voice was the voice of a man, choosing his words carefully. We have $5. I know. I just want to look. Walter looked at his wife. In 43 years, he had learned to distinguish between the things she said casually and the things she said with a particular quality of attention that meant she was seeing something he wasn't yet. This had the second quality. He turned the truck around. The Pemberton property was a farmstead at the edge of Harwick. 3 generations of accumulated living being sold off by descendants who had moved to Boston and Atlanta and had no use for the furniture, the tools, the hand-painted dishes, the various dignified debris of a family that had farmed this land for 100 years. There were 30 or 40 people there, moving through the yard and the house with the focused attention of buyers who knew what they were looking for. Walter and Evelyn walked slowly through the sale, touching nothing, because touching things when you have $5 feels dishonest. The furniture was priced at $20 and above. The kitchen items started at $8. A box of old books was tagged at $15. Everything was beyond them, and they both knew it. They were turning back toward the truck when Evelyn stopped. Away from the main sale, tacked to a fence post at the far edge of the yard, was a second, smaller sign, handwritten in pencil, partially obscured by a low-hanging branch. Back structure, as is. Best offer, minimum $3. Must remove or take ownership. Evelyn pulled the sign free and read it again. Silas, she said. She had called him Silas since their first year of marriage, a private name whose origin neither of them could any longer explain. Come look. They walked to the back of the property, past the barn and a woodshed, and through a gap in a stone wall, to the far corner where the Pemberton land met a stand of old maples. And there, in the corner, under more years of blackberry vine and wild grape and climbing honeysuckle than either of them had ever seen on a single structure, was a building. Building was being generous. What was visible beneath the vegetation was a small, dark shape, perhaps 10 feet by 12, its walls of old board-and-batten construction almost entirely hidden by the growth that had claimed it. One window was broken. The roof, what you could see of the peak through the vines, sagged in the center with the resigned quality of something that has been waiting a long time to be attended to. A man in work clothes came toward them from the direction of the barn. He was the estate sale manager, a broad, practical man named Gary who had the expression of someone who had been trying to offload this particular item all weekend without success. You folks looking at that? He sounded genuinely surprised. What is it? Walter asked. Gary shrugged. Old Pemberton never knew. His grandfather built the main farmhouse in 1912, and this thing was already here then. Some kind of storage structure. Maybe nobody's been in it in 40 years at least. I need it gone. Either somebody takes ownership or I'm calling a demolition crew next week. Walter looked at the structure with the eye of a carpenter. Through the vines, he could see the way the corner boards met. Tight, hand-fitted, the kind of joinery you didn't see anymore because it took time and skill and the assumption that what you were building was meant to last. The walls had aged to silver gray, but they had not buckled. The structure had settled, but not collapsed. "We'll take it," Evelyn said. Gary looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something in a language they don't quite speak. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you're looking at. That thing's got no electricity, no water, probably a family of raccoons in the ceiling." $3, Evelyn said. "That's what the sign says." Walter said nothing. He was still looking at the structure through the vines, reading it the way he read all old buildings. Not for what they were now, but for what they had been and what they were still capable of being. He could see the bones. He could see the quality in the bones. $3, Gary said slowly. "Yeah, all right. Your call." He scratched the back of his neck. "Let me get the paperwork." While Gary went for the bill of sale, a couple had drifted over from the main sale. The Hartleys, Roger and Diane Hartley, who had moved to Harwick 3 years ago from somewhere with more money than Harwick, and had since established themselves as people whose opinions on local matters were frequently and loudly held. Roger was already on his phone. "Are you actually buying that thing?" Diane asked. Her voice carried the bright, false concern of someone who is entertained rather than worried. "We are," Evelyn said pleasantly. "But where are you going to put it?" "We're going to live in it," Walter said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Roger Hartley laughed, and it was not the polite kind. "Live in it? That's not a house. It's barely a shed. It looks like it's been dead for 50 years. He was photographing it now, angling to get Walter and Evelyn in the frame. "Diane, get a picture of this. You cannot make this up. We're going to post this," Diane said, already typing. "Harwick, you will not believe what's happening at the Pemberton Estate sale." Evelyn looked at them with the expression of a 4th-grade teacher who has seen exactly this behavior before and is neither surprised nor interested in prolonging it. "Enjoy yourselves," she said, and turned back toward Gary, who had returned with a handwritten bill of sale. They signed it. They handed over $3 bills, all that remained of their cash, and Gary handed them a key. Small, brass, bent slightly, green with age. "It's all yours," Gary said. He looked at them with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, but was somewhere between the two. "Good luck." As they walked back toward their truck, Walter could hear the Hartleys behind them, still photographing, still narrating to their phones. He could hear other voices, too. Other estate sale attendees who had noticed the exchange and were processing it with the gentle cruelty of people for whom this was entertainment rather than someone's life. "Did they just buy that heap for $3? I heard they've been living in their truck. At their age. God, that's just sad. Or crazy. Honestly, probably both." Walter felt the back of his neck go hot. Evelyn's hand found his and held it. Not urgently, just steadily, the way she had held it across 4 decades of the various difficulties a life together accumulates. "Don't," she said quietly. Not a reprimand. Just a reminder of what mattered and what didn't. They got in the truck. Walter sat with his hands on the wheel and looked at the bill of sale on the seat between them. "Evelyn," he said, "we just spent our last $3 on a ruin that people are going to post on social media. I know. We have no gas money, no food money, and I have no idea if that thing is structurally sound enough to sleep in. I know that too." She picked up the key and turned it over in her hand. "But Walter, when I looked at that structure, I felt something. I can't explain it. I just felt like we were supposed to be there. Like it was waiting." He looked at her. 43 years, and he had learned to take seriously the things Evelyn felt rather than just the things she thought. She was not a fanciful person. She was a woman who had spent 32 years teaching children to read by starting from what was actually in front of her rather than what she wished was there. "Okay," he said, "let's go see our house." He started the truck. They waited until the estate sale had closed and the buyers had gone. Then Walter drove the truck slowly around the back of the property, navigating the uneven ground until they reached the far corner and the vine-covered structure. In the late October light, with the crowd gone and the noise of the sale replaced by the sound of wind in the maples and a distant conversation of crows, the structure had a different quality. Walter got out and stood in front of it for a long time, just looking. He pulled the blackberry canes back from the door with his leatherwork gloves. The wall beneath was board and batten, as he had seen from across the yard, but up close he could read it more clearly. The boards were wide, 12 to 14 inches across, which meant old-growth timber, the kind of tree that took a century or more to grow to sufficient size and that had not been commercially available since the early 1900s. The boards were hand-planed. He could see the subtle tracks of the plane and the grain, the slight irregularity that meant human hands rather than a machine. This had been built before machines were doing this work. Before the Civil War, possibly. He got the door open on the third attempt, putting his shoulder into it, feeling the swollen wood release with a groan that suggested it had not moved in a very long time. The smell came out first, cold air and old wood and something underneath that he couldn't quite name, something that was not decay, exactly, but was the smell of time, of accumulated years. Evelyn handed him the flashlight she kept in the truck's glove box. He clicked it on and stepped inside. The floor was wide plank pine, thick boards laid tight, covered in the debris of decades, dead leaves, old dirt, small animal evidence, but intact beneath. The ceiling was higher than he expected, perhaps 8 feet, with exposed hand-hewn rafters that showed the marks of the broadaxe that had shaped them. The walls were the same wide boards as the exterior, and in the light of his flashlight, Walter could see that they had been fitted with a care that went beyond functional. The corners were tight, the boards matched in grain and width in a way that suggested the builder had been thinking about beauty as well as shelter. "Come in," he called to Evelyn. "It's sound." She came through the low door and stood beside him, and they looked at what they had bought for $3 while the town of Harwick laughed at them. "The floor is good," Walter said. "The walls are good. The roof I can't tell yet, but the rafters look right. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Evelyn was not looking at the floor or the rafters. She was looking at the far wall. "Walter, bring the light over here." He crossed the room and shone the flashlight where she was pointing. And there, carved deep into the old pine planking, were letters. Clear, deliberate, made by someone who had taken time with them. NB 1849. They stood in a flashlight beam looking at those 4 characters. 1949 would have been old. 1849 was something else entirely. "That's 175 years ago," Evelyn said. "Before the Civil War," Walter said. They looked at each other in the dim space with the smell of old wood around them and the sound of October wind in the maples outside and the weight of what they might be standing, and began, slowly, to make itself felt. They slept there that night for the first time. Their sleeping bags side by side on the cleared floor, the truck parked outside, Walter's toolbox inside the door. It was cold, but the walls kept the wind out entirely, which was more than the truck had been doing. Evelyn lay awake for a while reading the carved initials with the flashlight. "NB," she said. "Who was NB?" "We'll find out tomorrow," Walter said. He was already nearly asleep. He hadn't slept this well in a month. The Harwick Town Hall and Public Library occupied a brick building on Pleasant Street, 2 blocks from the town common. The library's local history room was in the back, a small space that smelled of old paper and the particular quiet of accumulated records. The librarian who managed it was a woman named Frances Webb, who was 61 and had the focused competence of someone who had been doing this work long enough to be genuinely good at it and who still found it interesting, which was the combination that made her irreplaceable. Frances looked up from her desk when Walter and Evelyn came in. She assessed them quickly and accurately, the work clothes, the worn boots, the quality of their attention, and decided they were serious. "We're trying to identify someone from 1849, Walter said. Initials NB possibly connected to the Pemberton property at the edge of town. Francis's expression sharpened. How connected? Their initials are carved into a structure on that property, along with the year 1849. Francis looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up and said, "Come with me." She led them to the back room and began pulling archive boxes from the shelves with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is. "The Pemberton property," she said as she worked, "sits on what was originally the Bowman land grant. Nathan Bowman filed the original land claim in 1847. He was, well, let me show you." She laid a document on the reading table. It was a copy. The original was in the state archives in Augusta, but it was clear enough. A land grant from the territory of Maine, dated June of 1847, conveying 320 acres along Harwick Creek to one Nathan Bowman, described as settler and trader, for the purposes of establishing a trading post and supply station at the creek crossing. Nathan Bowman, N.B. Evelyn sat down, not because she was tired, but because her legs had made the decision without consulting her. Francis continued laying out documents with the careful rhythm of someone building a case. A letter from 1848, written by Bowman to a merchant in Portland, discussing his plans for the settlement. A surveyor's notation from 1849 referencing Bowman's post at the creek, first permanent structure in the settlement. A photograph, grainy, taken in the 1880s, showing a small weathered building at the edge of what was clearly early Harwick, with a caption in faded ink. Bowman Trading Post, EST 1847 to 49, first structure of Harwick settlement. Walter unfolded the bill of sale for their structure and spread it on the table beside the photograph. Francis leaned over both documents. She looked at the bill of sale. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the land description in the survey notation. She went very still for a moment. "Where exactly on the Pemberton property is this structure?" she asked. Walter described it. "The far northwest corner, the stone wall, the stand of old maples." Francis pulled out an old map, a hand-drawn survey from 1853, and laid it flat on the table. She traced the property boundaries with her finger, found the northwest corner, and stopped. "That is," she said quietly, "the location of Bowman's original trading post." Exactly. The room was completely silent except for the sound of the building's old heating system and Evelyn's breathing. "We own it," Walter said. He said the way he said things when he was testing whether they were true by saying them aloud. "We bought it for $3 at an estate sale." Francis looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back at the bill of sale. "Then you own," she said carefully, "what may be the oldest surviving structure in Harwick. The founding building of this town. The place where this entire community began." Evelyn picked up the key from where it lay on the table. The small bent brass key that Gary had handed them in exchange for $3 bills while the Hartleys photographed them for social media. "We need to go back," she said. "There may be more." There was more. Walter found the loose floorboard on the third day, which was how long it took him to get the interior clean enough to see the floor clearly. He had been working methodically, the way he worked on any old structure, carefully paying attention to what the building was telling him, not forcing anything. The loose board was near the north wall, slightly proud of its neighbors, with the particular quality of a board that has been lifted and replaced many times over many years. He called Evelyn in from outside, where she had been pulling the remaining vines from the exterior walls. Together they worked the board up with the flat of a pry bar, gently, the way you open something old. Beneath it was a cavity perhaps 8 inches deep, running the width of the wall. And in the cavity, wrapped in what had been oilcloth, but was now mostly a dark, fibrous memory of oilcloth, was a metal box. Heavy, iron, padlocked with a mechanism so rusted it could not be locked in any functional sense. The shackle turned freely when Walter tried it. They carried it outside into the October light. Inside the box, protected by the metal and by the cavity above the ground where moisture had never collected, was a collection of objects that had been waiting since approximately 1852 to be found. The first thing they saw was a journal. Leather-bound, dry and cracked but structurally intact, the cover tooled with a simple geometric border. Walter lifted it carefully and opened to the first page. Journal and record of Nathan Bowman, Trading Post, Harwick Settlement, Maine. Commenced year of our Lord 1849. Frances had given them her card and told them to call if they found anything. Walter called her from the property and described what they had found, and Frances arrived 40 minutes later in a state of barely controlled professional excitement. She went through the contents of the box with the focused reverence of someone handling things that belong to history rather than to individuals. Beneath the journal were hand-drawn maps of the original settlement and the surrounding territory, detailed, accurate, showing Harwick Creek and the surrounding land in a way that matched the modern topography with remarkable precision. There were letters, folded, bound with a fragment of leather cord. And at the bottom of the box, 3 documents that made Frances go completely silent for nearly a full minute. The first was a land grant. Not the copy in the town records, but the original, on heavy linen paper with the territorial seal still intact in red wax, granting Nathan Bowman ownership of 320 acres and the rights associated with operating the sole licensed trading and postal station for the Harwick Creek settlement. The second was a charter, signed by representatives of the territorial government and bearing multiple wax seals, formally designating Bowman's Post as the official supply and communications hub for the surrounding territory. The charter included language that Frances read and then reread very carefully before she said anything. This grants perpetual rights, she said slowly, to the trading post and the holder of title to it. Specifically, water access rights to Harwick Creek, rights of way across certain territorial boundaries, and mineral rights associated with the original land grant. What does that mean in practical terms? Evelyn asked. Frances sat back on her heels in the dry October grass. I'm a librarian, not a lawyer. I don't know what any of these rights are worth in current law, or how they would be interpreted after 175 years. But I know that you need a lawyer who specializes in historic property claims. Today, not tomorrow. The third document was a letter written in Nathan Bowman's handwriting. They could match it to the journal, addressed to no one in particular, dated June of 1852. To whoever finds these records, it began, I'm setting aside these documents in this place because I believe this post and the land rights attending it should be preserved for the use of this settlement and those who come after. The charter grants these rights in perpetuity to the holder of this structure. I ask only that whoever holds this title remembers that Harwick was built by people who helped one another because there was no other way to survive, and that whatever benefit these records provide be used in that same spirit. I built this post to serve travelers and settlers who had nothing and needed something. I hope it continues to serve in some such way. En Bowman. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the box. He knew someone would find it, she said. He left it on purpose. He was trusting the future, Walter said. They looked at each other in the afternoon light, and both of them understood at the same moment that they had been handed something that was not just about them. Frances Webb connected them with a property attorney in Portland named William Crawford, who specialized in historic land claims and who agreed, after a 40-minute phone call during which Walter described the documents in detail, to make the 3-hour round trip to Harwick the following morning. Crawford arrived with a colleague and spent 4 hours at the structure. He examined the documents with the focused attention of someone whose professional life had been spent understanding exactly this kind of material. He photographed everything. He made notes. He spoke in low, careful sentences to his colleague that Walter and Evelyn could not hear. At the end of the 4 hours, Crawford sat with them in the truck cab. It was the only dry, windproof space available and told them what he thought. "I need to be clear," he said, "that this will require extensive legal research and potentially court proceedings, and that my initial assessment may change as we understand the documents better. But based on what I'm seeing," he paused, "the charter is authentic. The land grant is authentic. The water access rights granted in the charter are almost certainly still legally binding. Maine has strong case law supporting historical water rights claims. Several businesses operating along Harwick Creek are doing so without the authorization that this charter requires. Those businesses would need to negotiate settlements with the holder of the charter." "What kind of settlements?" Walter asked. "Difficult to say precisely at this stage, but potentially significant. Additionally, the mineral rights in the original land grant. I've checked the county records. When the Bowman land was subdivided over the following decades and sold in parcels, the mineral rights were never explicitly transferred. They defaulted to the land grant holder. That would be whoever holds the title to this structure." "Are their minerals worth anything?" Evelyn asked. "Probably not extraction minerals," Crawford said. "But Maine has significant geothermal potential in some areas, and there are energy companies currently surveying portions of this county. If any of the original 320 acres shows potential, the mineral rights holder has significant negotiating power. Combined with the water rights settlements, we could be looking at a total claim in the range of $2 to $3 million. The truck cab was very quiet. "We paid $3, Walter said. "I'm aware," Crawford said, "which is, in my 25 years of practice, the single most extraordinary return on investment I have personally encountered." He permitted himself a small smile. "I'll take the case. My fee will be a percentage of any settlement. No upfront costs. This is too important to lose because of legal fees. Word moved through Harwick the way word always moves through small towns, faster than any intentional announcement, reaching people who had no particular reason to know, before people who had every reason to know. By the following weekend, the story of what Walter and Evelyn Marsh had found in the vine-covered structure on the old Pemberton property was the primary subject of conversation at the Harwick Diner, the hardware store, the post office, and apparently at a significant number of kitchen tables. The Hartleys, who had been among the first to photograph the Marsh's purchase and post it online with mocking captions, now found that the internet's relationship with their post had shifted in ways they had not anticipated. The same story they had shared for entertainment had become a different story, and the comments beneath their post had taken on a quality that made Diane Hartley put her phone down several times and not pick it up again for a while. Frances Webb, whose institutional role as town librarian meant she was expected to remain neutral in civic matters, was nonetheless visibly and entirely unable to conceal that she considered this the most significant historical event in Harwick in her professional memory. She organized, within 2 weeks of the discovery, an emergency session of the Harwick Historical Commission, at which experts from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and the University of Maine's History Department presented their preliminary authentication findings. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The Bowman Trading Post was authentic, was the founding structure of Harwick, and was in a sufficiently intact state of original construction to qualify for immediate listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The wide plank floors, the hand-hewn rafters, the board and batten walls of old-growth timber, all of it consistent with the 1840s through 1860s period, all of it consistent with Bowman's documented presence in the area. The structure was the oldest building in Harwick by approximately 25 years. It predated the town's formal incorporation. It was, as one historian put it at the commission meeting, the acorn from which this entire community grew. The Hartleys were at the commission meeting. They sat in the third row and said nothing. The National Register designation came through 6 weeks after the commission meeting, which was fast. The designation brought with it a preservation grant of $140,000 from the Maine Historic Preservation Office to be used for restoration and protection of the structure. It also brought a formal letter from the Harwick Board of Selectmen requesting a meeting with Walter and Evelyn Marsh. The meeting was held at Town Hall on a Tuesday evening in January. The Selectmen's Chamber was a wood-paneled room that smelled of institutional coffee and had held town meetings for 100 years. It was full. The Select Board chair was a woman named Barbara Holt, a practical, direct person who had run a hardware business for 20 years before entering civic life, and who brought to municipal governance the same no-nonsense approach she had brought to inventory management. She opened the meeting by acknowledging, plainly and without diplomatic softening, that the town of Harwick had a great deal to account for. The Bowman Trading Post, she said, has been sitting on the edge of this town, unmarked and forgotten, for approximately a century. The state records that would have identified it were in our own town archive. The photograph, identifying it, has been in our library's collection for decades. We had every resource we needed to find and preserve our founding structure, and we did not find it, and we did not preserve it. Walter and Evelyn Marsh, who had between them $3 and were sleeping in their truck, found it in 48 hours. I think we owe them an honest accounting of that failure before we discuss anything else. The room was quiet. Additionally, Barbara Holt continued, a number of our residents treated the Marsh's purchase with mockery and public ridicule. Photographs were shared on social media. Comments were made. I'm not going to name anyone because I think people know who they are, and I'm not going to make this a spectacle. But I want to say clearly, on behalf of this town's government, that behavior was wrong. These were two people in genuine hardship trying to survive with dignity, and Harwick treated them as entertainment. We should be ashamed of that. Several people in the room were looking at their hands. Mrs. Marsh, Barbara Holt said, "Would you like to speak?" Evelyn stood. She had taught 4th grade for 32 years, which meant she had spent 32 years in rooms where the atmosphere could shift in a moment and where the person at the front had to hold steady regardless. She was comfortable in front of people. She was not comfortable with sentimentality, her own or anyone else's. She said what she meant to say. "Walter and I are not going to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen," she said. "We lost our savings, our house, and a good portion of our dignity to a medical system that will bankrupt families for the crime of surviving serious illness. And we are not the only people this has happened to, and we will not be the last. That is the reality we were living when we drove past that estate sale sign. We bought a $3 structure because it was all we had, and we bought it because something told me it mattered. I can't explain that more precisely than that. I just felt it. What I want to say to this town is not about what we found or what it's worth legally. I want to say something about what it means to be looked at by the people around you and found lacking. To have your circumstances used as entertainment. To walk through a place where everyone knows you and feel invisible and contemptible at the same time." She paused. That experience does not go away when the circumstances change. The people who posted those photos, who made those comments, I don't hold a permanent grievance against any of you. I know how it works. When something seems absurd, we laugh. When someone seems to be failing, we reassure ourselves that we are not. That's human. But I want you to understand that it costs something. It costs the person on the other side of the camera something real. And I want to ask every person in this room to think about that the next time someone in front of you is struggling. The room was completely still. "Now," Evelyn said, "Walter and I have made some decisions about what we want to do with what we've found, and I'd like to share them." William Crawford had, in the 6 weeks since being retained, determined with increasing precision the value of the legal claims attached to the Bowman Trading Post. The water access rights he had found were being used by 4 businesses along Harwick Creek, 2 small manufacturers, a hydroelectric microstation, and a resort developer, without the authorization that the Bowman Charter required. Negotiated settlements with all 4, he estimated, would produce between $800,000 and $1.2 million. The mineral rights, which covered portions of the original 320 acres now occupied by a significant number of Harwick properties, were potentially subject to claims in the range of $1 to $2 million, depending on geothermal assessments currently underway. Total potential value of the legal claims, somewhere between $2 and $3 million. Walter and Evelyn had spent 3 evenings at the library's reading table, after hours, with Francis Webb's permission, going through Nathan Bowman's journal. It was detailed, specific, and written with the clarity of a man who trusted that someone would eventually read it. Bowman had built his trading post, he wrote, because he understood that the people using the creek crossing, settlers, traders, trappers, families moving north, needed a fixed point, somewhere they could stop, somewhere they knew someone would be there. "I am not in the business of charity," he had written in the fall of 1849, "but I am in the business of hospitality, which is different. Charity is given to people as lesser. Hospitality is offered to people as equal. Every person who comes through this post is my equal, and I treat them so, regardless of what they carry or don't carry." Walter had read that passage aloud to Evelyn and then sat quietly with it for a while. They knew what they wanted to do. Standing in the selectman's chamber, Evelyn outlined it. The preservation grant of $140,000 would be used to restore the Bowman Trading Post with full historical integrity. The structure would be preserved exactly as it was, in the materials and methods of its original construction, while being made weathertight and safe for use. This was non-negotiable. The building would remain as it was built. The water rights settlements would be negotiated not for maximum extraction, but for fair value, with the goal of resolving the title issues rather than enriching the claimants. The businesses along the creek had operated in good faith without knowing the charter existed. Walter and Evelyn were not interested in punishing good faith. The mineral rights claims, similarly, would be resolved through nominal fees to existing property owners, $100 per parcel, regardless of size, clearing the title issues and generating a modest fund without placing unfair burdens on people who had bought their properties without knowledge of the historical complication. The total proceeds from the legal settlements, after Crawford's fees, were estimated at approximately $2.4 million. Walter and Evelyn's plan for that money was the part that made the room go entirely quiet. They were establishing a foundation. The Bowman Foundation, named for the man who had written in his journal about the difference between charity and hospitality. The foundation's purpose, as Evelyn described it, was specific. Nathan Bowman built his trading post for people who needed a fixed point, she said. A place where someone would be there. That's what we're going to build. A resource center for seniors in Harwick and the surrounding area who are facing what we faced, medical debt, housing instability, the particular catastrophe that happens when you do everything right for 40 years and then a diagnosis undoes all of it in 18 months. Walter and Evelyn would live on the property as caretakers in a small addition built adjacent to the restored trading post. The foundation would employ a social worker and an administrator. It would maintain an emergency fund for utility payments and medical bills. It would provide practical assistance, help navigating insurance claims, connecting people with legal aid, the specific unglamorous help that makes the difference between surviving and not surviving. "We don't need millions of dollars," Walter said, speaking for the first time. "We need a house, which this gives us. We need a purpose, which this gives us. And we need to know that the thing we found gets used the way it was meant to be used." That's it. Barbara Holt, the select board chair, had been making notes during the entire presentation. She looked up. "The town of Harwick," she said, "would like to be a partner in this foundation. Formally, financially, and in terms of civic support. I'd like to bring a formal proposal to the next board meeting. But I want to say something first on behalf of the board." She looked at Walter and Evelyn directly. "You had $3. You were sleeping in your truck. And when you found something valuable, the first thing you thought about was how to use it to help other people who might end up where you were. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of character that does not come from comfort or security. It comes from having been in the dark and choosing, when you find the light, to turn it toward others." She paused. "Harwick does not deserve you, but we're going to try." The Hartleys came to see Walter on a Thursday in February, which was the week after the selectmen's meeting and the week before the formal announcement of the Bowman Foundation. Roger Hartley called first, asking if they could come by. Walter said yes. They drove out to the structure, which by February was in the early stages of restoration. The vines cleared from the exterior walls, the roof temporarily stabilized, the interior cleaned and documented. Walter met them outside. Roger Hartley was a man who had been successful at various things in his adult life, and who had arranged his personality around that success in ways that were not, Walter thought, entirely his fault. Some people learn early that confidence is rewarded, and they learn to display it whether or not it's warranted, and it takes a specific kind of shock to interrupt the habit. Roger Hartley appeared to have received that shock. "We owe you an apology," he said. He said it without the particular quality of a person performing an apology, which Walter had expected and which would have made things harder. He said it the way people say things when they have thought about them seriously and arrived somewhere real. "What we did, the photos, the posts, the comments, it was cruel. We didn't think of you as people who were in pain. We thought of you as a story that was funny. That was wrong." Diane Hartley had been crying before they arrived, Walter thought. Her eyes had the quality of eyes that had been crying recently and are making an effort not to do so currently. "I've taken the post down," she said. "I know that doesn't undo anything." "No," Evelyn said, from where she stood beside Walter. "It doesn't, but it's the right thing to do anyway. Is there anything we can do?" Roger asked. "For the foundation for the restoration. Anything." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that Walter had not expected her to say, which was also true of most of the best things she had ever said. "Yes," she said. "Tell the story honestly. Not the version where we found treasure and everything turned out fine. The version where you saw two people struggling and made it worse, and then you had to think about what that meant about who you were, and you came back. That version. Tell that one." The Hartleys were quiet. "The people who will use the Bowman Foundation," Evelyn continued, "are going to be people like us. Older people. People who have lost things. People who look from the outside like they have nothing worth paying attention to. And every person who encounters them is going to make the same choice you made that day at the estate sale. They're going to decide in about 3 seconds whether this is a person or a situation, whether this is someone to help or something to photograph." She looked at them steadily. "You have the chance to make a different choice going forward. That's what I'd like from you. Not money. A different choice." Roger Hartley nodded slowly. "We can do that," he said. "We want to do that." They shook hands, all 4 of them, in the cold February morning in front of the oldest building in Harwick. Walter watched the Hartleys drive away and then turned to look at the structure behind him. The silver gray boards, the careful joinery, the initials carved into the wood by a man who had understood in 1849 that a fixed point matters, that someone being there matters. The hospitality and charity are different things. "You all right?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Walter said. "I'm good." He meant entirely. 1 year after buying the Bowman Trading Post for $3, Walter and Evelyn Marsh stood on the new cedar porch of their small caretaker's cottage and watched the sun come up over Harwick. The restoration was complete. The Trading Post looked as it had been built to look, the wide boards planed by hand, the tight corner joinery, the rafters bearing the marks of the broadaxe that had shaped them in 1849. The floor where Walter had found the loose board bore a small brass plate now, set flush with the pine, engraved with the text of Nathan Bowman's letter. The carved initials on the wall had been documented, preserved, and illuminated with a small light that Francis Webb had helped them choose for historical accuracy. Adjacent to the Trading Post, a modest addition housed the Bowman Foundation's office and resource center. Francis Webb had left the library after 30 years to serve as the Foundation's first director, which she said was the only professional decision she had ever made that she didn't have to think about for more than a day. In the first year of operation, the Bowman Foundation had helped 51 individuals and couples in the Harwick area. Emergency utility payments for 11 households. Medical bill navigation for 23 people, resulting in reduced charges and payment plans that made the remaining amounts manageable. Housing assistance for 8 people facing eviction or displacement. legal aid referrals for 9 others. Not millions of dollars worth of help. The specific, practical, unglamorous help that means the difference between a person keeping their heat on in February and a person who doesn't. Walter still did carpentry. He had taken on a partner, a young man named Cole who was good with his hands and who was, Walter thought, going to be excellent in another 10 years. Together, they had done the finished work on the addition themselves, which meant it was done right. Evelyn taught a weekly reading group for seniors at the community center, which had nothing to do with the foundation and everything to do with the fact that she was a person who needed to be teaching something or she didn't feel entirely like herself. They had a home. They had a purpose. They had each other, which was what they had started with 43 years ago and which remained, as far as both of them were concerned, the primary asset. On the porch in the early light, Walter reached into his shirt pocket and took out something he'd been carrying for a year. A single dollar bill, soft from handling, folded to a small square. He unfolded it and looked at it. "The third dollar," Evelyn said, "from the 3 we spent." He had kept it without really explaining to himself why. Now he thought he knew. "I'm going to frame it." He went inside and came back with a small frame he had made the previous week from a piece of the old growth pine he had salvaged during the restoration. A piece too small for structural use, too good to throw away. He fitted the dollar bill into the frame and hung it beside the door of the trading post. Beneath it, he fixed a small plaque. He had thought for a long time about what to put on it. In the end, he used Bowman's own words from the journal entry dated October of 1849. "I am in the business of hospitality, which is different from charity. Charity is given to people as lesser. Hospitality is offered to people as equal." He stepped back and looked at it. "Good," Evelyn said from beside him. "Yes," he said, "it is." They stood together on the porch of a building that was 175 years old, in the early morning light of a town that had laughed at them and then learned from that laughter and was still learning. The creek was audible in the distance, Harwick Creek, running where it had always run, through land that Nathaniel Bowman had claimed in 1847 because he understood that people moving through difficult country needed a fixed point, a place where someone would be there. That was still true. It turned out it had always been true. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what stayed with you. Whether it was the moment Walter read the joinery on those old boards and knew, or the morning the Hartleys came back and chose to be different, or the words Nathaniel Bowman wrote in 1849 that turn out to still be exactly right. We believe stories like this one matter because they remind us that the people we write off, the ones who seem to have nothing, the ones we photograph instead of help, are carrying something we cannot see from the outside. And sometimes what they are carrying is the foundation of everything. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we are preparing for you.